Good morning, good morning. I'm like Rodney Dangerfield. I don't have any respect here, so we got to warm everybody up. Thank you for taking your time to be here this morning. We're going to do a brief demonstration on substrate prep and determining what our surface that we're going to be working with on the wall and the floor. I'm Scott Carruthers from the Ceramic Tile Education Foundation, and you are?
My name is Rob Roderick, and I'm with the National Tile Contractors Association. Thank you guys for being here. Every time we get together and do educational programs and demonstrations, we always go to the industry standards and guidelines. We find those in the Tile Council North America Handbook and the American National Standards Institute, and also we've got a reference manual, NTCA reference manual, which is a great resource. It's set up in a problem, cause, cure format. So if you guys don't have these publications, you need to have them because as Scott often says, they can be your best friend or your worst enemy. Basically, it's the industry's opinion of how we should do installations. I oftentimes say I've got my opinion and you've got your opinion, but if you get into a courtroom, the only opinion that's going to matter is the opinion that we find from the industry and these standards. So
absolutely. So we're going to take a look at a floor substrate first. So here we have basically a concrete surface over which we're going to be installing tile. So we have got a couple of parameters that all are within the context of the handbook and especially in ANSI for guidelines. So Rob, what's that device you have in your hand?
Right here. So, the concrete guys, they have FF numbers and FL numbers, and they use lasers, and they're kind of fancy, right? They've got a technique of the way that they check for flatness and level. Our standards that I just mentioned to you say that we check them with a 10-foot straight edge, and that's what I have right here. And we can lay that straight edge on the surface, and we're basically looking for any deviation in that surface. And we have two major standards that I want everybody to walk away and remember. One of them is for large format tile. And if you're not familiar with what a large format tile is, it's any tile that has one side that's 15 inches or larger. And for large format tile, our standard is we should have no deviation. And when I say deviation, that means no hump or a dip of more than 1/8 of an inch and 10 foot.
So also, is that 10 foot?
This is a 10 foot, and this is how we're going to check it. And so, and we shouldn't have more than a 1/16 of an inch and 2 foot with those large format tiles. Now, all the other tiles that are smaller than that, it's a 1/4 of an inch in 10. And so, there's a disparity between the FF numbers and the FL numbers and the way that we check stuff. How many people here actually are architects or specify stuff? Does anybody do that kind of work here? How many guys are contractors here? Okay, we've got a lot of contractors. You're our people. Well, you guys are all our people, but basically, one thing that we encourage our members to do is if you're sending out estimates, send out estimates with disclaimers that say all surfaces to receive tile must meet the TCNA standard of no deviation of more than 1/4 of an inch, or additional prep will be required that's not reflected in this estimate. Because this is a lot of additional work, and we need to get paid for that work.
So we've got a 10-foot straight edge and an 8-foot box. How are we going to make that work?
We're going to have to get a smaller straight edge, Scott, which we have one here.
So we've got this surface here. Are we up overhead? Okay, so take this smaller straight edge only because it fits in here. But when we go across here, we're going to shoot. We see right here that we've got a low spot, and we go back to this corner. I don't know if the camera can pick that up, but we've got an extremely low spot in this back corner. So we've got to fill that area. Depending on what product we're going to use, we're going to do that tomorrow.
Yes, we're going to do self-leveling tomorrow.
So we're just checking here to make sure I don't have any high spots except this one right here in the middle. So we've got to be able to flatten this. Does everybody understand the difference between the words flat and level? Artie, you know the difference between flat and level? Do you know the difference between flat and level? We have to have flat. We would love to have level, but we got to have flat because, as Rob said, with a tile that's 15 inches or larger, we need to have that flat plane so that we can keep the lippage within the tolerance of the ANSI specification.
Right, and what's happened to our industry over the last 20 years? What's happened to the size of the tile? That's right, it keeps getting bigger. And what's happened to the size of the grout joint? When you have a gigantic tile and a little bitty grout joint, you got to have a really flat surface. And I tell you, actually in the NTCA reference manual, there's a correlation with those. Remember when I was talking about FF numbers and what the concrete guys use and floor flatness? And it basically says that an FF number of 60 would be something that you'd want for these larger, like 36 by 36 inch tiles with a small grout joint. And what's considered in the concrete industry is like a FF number of 30 or something around that range. So there's definitely a disparity between the two, and you're going to have to do some prep. With those kind of numbers, an 1/8 of an inch and 10, I'm from Missouri, and I've put tile on walls and floors just about everywhere around there. I don't know that I've ever found a surface that met that.
Well, here, let's ask that question.
Yeah.
Of the installers out there, how many times have you ever seen something that was even 1/4 of an inch in 10 feet? What's the matter? You guys not living today? Somebody wake up. We don't get that. That's the real problem. We should be getting it, but we don't. So the second piece of that puzzle is we have to fix it. How many people here would like someone else to do their repair work for them? You would really trust that guy to do a job that's satisfactory to you? Would you do a better job? That's why you want to do it. And here's the critical piece. You should get paid for doing that. So we have to make sure this is flat enough. Rob, we have some severe problems here. We've got this high spot in the center. We've got a significant low spot in that corner. And right here, we've got a dip here that goes toward the outside wall. So we've got to flatten this surface. We have two options. Either a patch material, a cement-based patch, or we could use a self-leveler, which we're now going to start calling flowable hydraulic cement underlayment. We just love acronyms, so we're going to make another one.
And we've got one other option too. We could if we had enough room, we could float a mud bed in there.
We could do a mud bed, which would be ideal for flat. How many people here have ever fixed a floor or a wall with thin set?
Come on.
Let's
get on.
My hand was the first one up. I've done it. Not that I'm proud of it, and sometimes you might get away with it, but it's not the proper product. It's A, it's too expensive to do that. B, it doesn't set up fast enough. And C, if you put it in too heavily, it'll shrink and actually pull your tile down with it. Now you have a lippage issue. So don't do the thin set thing any longer. Use the proper product. So Rob, I'm ready to go with my flatness. I've got another couple of things that we should probably be doing with this surface.
Yeah.
Anybody here know what the letters, here it is, were the acronym capital of the tile industry? SSD. Anybody know what SSD is? That's saturated surface dry. So we want this surface, is this thirsty?
It's thirsty.
If it's thirsty, we've got to give it a drink because we want it to take the water from that sponge in that bucket to hydrate this surface as opposed to pulling the moisture out of our thin set mortar. Because if it pulls it out of our mortar, what's going to happen to the top where we troweled? It's going to skin over. So if it skins over, do we get transfer and contact to the back of the tile? Nada. So that's really critical. So Rob is doing this. This is only 32 square feet. If we had 320 square feet, I guarantee you he would have a garden sprayer with a nozzle and spray this. All we've got to do is make sure that it's dampened to the surface, saturated, surface dry. So think about it. We're saturating the surface underneath. Can we have standing water on the top for installing tile? What happens when we trowel thin set mortar across that water? We got a bond breaker. Believe it or not, we mix the thin set with water, but the water is now a bond breaker to us, so the water has got to go away. So we have to either dry that surface off with a towel, or we've got to let it air dry, but now the moisture is filling that board or concrete up so that it's not going to pull the moisture out of our thin set mortar prematurely.
Yeah, so there's actually an ASTM test, a water droplet test. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but basically to check your concrete surfaces, you can just drop water on that surface, and then if it beads up like it beads up on a wax car, you know you got a problem. You know you need to open that pore structure. If it soaks in too rapidly, it may be a situation where we need to employ this SSD or possibly use a primer if a manufacturer approves that. So
right, sir.
That's
and one thing too, if you have a concrete surface, have you ever seen a concrete surface that's actually black or has black spots in the concrete? That is the fault of the concrete contractor, because what they've done is they've overwatered the surface, turned the paddles on the power trowel up too steeply, and they actually burned the surface, and already the floor will look the color of your shirt. The problem with that is when you use the water drop test, it'll actually bead up. No sealer, no contaminant of any type on there. It's made the surface very, very dense, and the water can't penetrate. If the water can't penetrate, neither can the thin set mortar. So we've got to somehow mechanically open that pore structure up.
And if we're looking at substrates in wet areas like showers or any place that needs a slope, you know, we have a standard for that 1/4 inch per foot slope that we need, no more than 1/2 of an inch. But we also want to make sure that we got that slope, but a flat surface with that slope. So that's why it says, you know, 1/4 of an inch and 10 from the required plane, because the required plane might be, you know, sloping 1/4 of an inch a foot all the way down the deck.
Well, one thing I was remiss, what we could do too, with newer technology, we could also check for flat on this floor with our laser, and we can go through there and we can actually mark the floor, and we can actually put pins in there for our flowable hydraulic cement underlayment, so that we know that this area here is going to be 1/4 of an inch at the low spot, but back there it's 3/8 to 1/2 an inch, so we can set our pins so that we're sure to get as flat a surface as we can. This is a great tool.
Yeah, and so for wall installations, as soon as we arrive, we want to check and make sure that our corners are plumb, our ceiling's level. This is the responsibility of the tile contractor. It's not your responsibility to build it plumb and level, but your responsibility to check it and make sure that it is. And if it isn't, then at that point you need to contact the architect, the designer, and report to them. If you see any of these problems before you start, that's your responsibility. If you take and go ahead and do your installation without checking those things, and you find out leadership, you just take an ownership for that. So you need to go through and do a thorough inspection of your substrate, make sure it's in place. If there's stuff that needs to be done, report it to the architect or designer immediately.
So what's our size of our tile? What's our feature?
What's our size? 12 by 24.
What don't we have a feature band?
Yeah, it's 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch.
1/4 inch by 1/4 inch tile. We're in serious trouble. I'm 1/4 of an inch out at the top this way, but I'm actually this way at the top this way. So this wall's leaning this way, this one's leaning that way. So if we have a 1/4 inch feature tile in our feature band, we're going to lose one piece of tile from the top to the bottom of that wall. Is that acceptable? Of course not. So we've got to either repair the wall, or we've got to go to the framing contractor and say, that's got to be changed. This is not working well. We've got to have a flatter surface, and it's got to be plumb.
So how many of you guys have done exterior installations, tiles outside? Okay. Well, one of the big things is surface temperature. How many of you guys have seen a little thermometer like this for your barbecue or whatever? You need one of these. You know, most of the manufacturers of mortar, self-leveling, they want those products to be done around 50 to 80 degrees. And you know, if you have an ambient air temperature, the air temperature that day is 80 degrees, but you got sun shining on a concrete slab, it'll be closer to 120 degrees. It'll be well beyond what the manufacturer wants. So we have to think about different ways to make that surface right for tile. We can put some shade over it. We can, you know, spray it with a hose. Again, we don't want puddles and we don't want standing water, but we can cool it off quickly. But we should always use one of these when we're on exteriors, and pay attention to the water that we're using, not letting it being set out in the sun, the mortar, the tile itself.
So tell me, what do we have on our surface there?
64 degrees. We're within.
So how about the water? How warm is our water?
70 degrees. So just that little bit I did here cooled this down 5 degrees just in that amount of time.
And one thing you've got to watch, especially if you're working out of a garden hose, and if it's black and it's outside, the water temperature could actually burn you when you turn that water on. If we were to put that water in the bucket and use that for our mixed water, that setting material will probably go off right in the bucket.
Yeah.
So you want to try to keep your water in the summertime as cool as opposed to the winter time. We've got to keep it warm enough. So we normally have to be in a window of opportunity somewhere 45 to 90 degrees depending on the manufacturer. So that's why those words are on the bag. They mean things. We want to make sure we follow the guidelines, because if you say the thin set went off too quickly, what was the temperature of the bag? Was the bag stored outside? where was the water stored, and what's the surface temperature. It's really critical that we get those three things accomplished before we start to mix and set tile.
You know, we do a talk on failures. We talk about the leading failures in the tile industry, and one big one is not getting adequate mortar coverage. Doing the proper prep and making sure you have a flat surface can really help you to get better mortar coverage. You know, for an exterior installation, we need to have 95% mortar coverage. For interiors, we need 80% mortar coverage. If we've got a situation where the floor is way out of tolerance and we're spreading that mortar down in the dip and we're setting our tile, we're just hitting the high points of it. We're never going to reach those requirements that we need to reach that are our responsibility as a tile contractor to meet. So we always want to make sure and check that floor, get it prepped out the right way. Think about plumb, level, flat, slope. Make sure the surface isn't so porous that it sucks the moisture out. Do we have any questions? Anybody got any questions? Right here. Say again? Uh-huh. Yes.
The question's about torpedo heaters. What's the fuel?
Kerosene?
Propane or kerosene, you've got two problems. Propane is loaded with a lot of water. I've actually seen jobs where they've had propane running and there's actually standing water on the surface of the concrete because that moisture is so high from the propane, it resides now on the surface, and that's got to go. That's our bond breaker that we looked at a while ago. The second thing is if it's a petrochemical, it's kerosene, you're now spewing an oil-based contaminant into the air. Where's it going to fall? It's going on the floor, so now you've got a contaminant on a surface which you thought was okay, and now find you've got a bond breaker between the two. You do the job, everything goes well, everything's wrapped up, you're paid, and 30 days later they come back and say, hey, we've got hollow sounding tile. No way possible. We've got coverage, we did the whole thing. That contaminant in between is going to cause that bond break, it's going to shear. And now we've got a separated surface. That is a defect, both audibly, but also it's going to come loose. The grout joints are going to start to deteriorate. It's all part of that puzzle. So really be careful. The permanent heat is really the best way to go. I fought with general contractors all the time in the wintertime from my area of central Pennsylvania. It gets cold. One general contractor in particular used to come in and have his city superintendent and turn the heat off at 5 o'clock. So we get there the next morning, it's 38 degrees in there. Now, 38 degrees right here, that's where a thermostat's mounted, about 60 inches off the floor. If it's 38 degrees here, what is it down there? It's below freezing. So we have a significant problem. So temperature is very, very critical to make sure we maintain the temperature of the job site, the product. We don't want to keep it out in the truck. If it's below zero and you're setting materials out in that truck, it's not going to function well at all.
Yeah, so I guess the big takeaway, guys, is we have a responsibility to inspect the substrate before we get started. We don't want to just take it and go to work, because once we do that, us as contractors take on that responsibility. When we find problems, we need to report those problems. And this prep, floating these floors and floating these walls, that's extra work. You need to get paid for it, you know? So hopefully there'll be allowances in the bidding of it to allow for that separation between what the concrete guy can do and what the tile guy can do. And we're working to try to make those kind of things happen.
So Rob, is the old saying of, if you touch it, you own it? Is that true?
That's exactly right. And that's the main.
So be careful. And with one of these, there is no excuse for not being able to communicate with someone. The owner, the general contractor, the architect, or someone. Put it in writing to them in a very brief email saying this structure is below the tolerance level of the American National Standards Institute.
Yeah, and
it's your best friend.
If you present it that way, you present it as, this isn't my standard, this is what the industry says about it. Who else has a question? We just got a few minutes left. Right here. There you go, yeah.
Artie's question is, can we basically, I'm going to paraphrase. Can we prep a floor with acid? I see zombies out here. Acid is the worst thing you can use. A couple of reasons. One is that acid doesn't go away when you rinse it with water. It's an acid, it's low on the pH scale. We actually have to come in with a high alkaline product to counterbalance it to call it neutral. So rinsing acid once or twice, thinking it goes away, and by the way, it should not be going down the public sewer system. It's not a good idea. It kills all the things that grow in those treatment plants, so you don't want to do that. But acid is going to reside there, so now you think you've gotten rid of the acid, so now you come in with thinset. What do we mix thinset with?
Water.
Water. The water now reactivates the acid that's residing in the concrete, and now you've got a crystalline structure growing between the thinset and the substrate, and it's going to push it apart. I'd give you the word for it, but I'll butcher it, so I'll just let it at that.
I think that's about all we got time for. We got a lot of stuff to move. You guys have been a great audience. Thank you so much. If you got questions afterwards, we'll be right around here.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Biggest crowd we've had, so thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Best looking crowd.